Thanks very much for downloading the Oddjob pod. In this episode, we'll be discussing the work of Sir Sean Connery, who passed away in October 2020.
Hello and welcome to the Oddjob pod. Please do pull up a chair, make sure you're wearing your best tuxedo, light a cigarette, get your vodka martini, shaken, not stirred, and make sure that whatever you do, you don't order red wine with fish. Later, we might even attempt an assault on Alcatraz if we're feeling in the mood for it. Yes, please join myself for this podcast, Gary Andrews, and my co-hosts, Terry DeFellin and Graham Sibley. There's only one thing that we could really be talking about on this podcast, as we're celebrating the life and times of the original Mr. Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, Sean Connery. Gentlemen, obviously this is a slightly odder Oddjob pod, because in another world we would be probably discussing No Time to Die, and instead we're discussing, the passing of really an absolute icon of the cinema. Obviously, a man who has very much defined and is probably the reason that we are doing this podcast in the first place. Sean Connery passed away at the age of 90s in the Bahamas, which feels like a very James Bond way to go, if I'm honest. Terry, I'll go to you first. I mean, when you kind of heard the news, it's obviously quite sad, but then he's also had a quite fantastic life, as we're going to look back over.
Yeah, it is sad. I mean, of course, because because in the way that you would feel grief for losing maybe shall we say, a distant relative, but of an age, 90, it's a good age, it's a fine innings, and a great life that he's lost. So you don't feel that sense of tragedy or loss associated with it. I must confess, although I do feel sadness when, famous people that I like pass away. You don't know them, but, so I don't necessarily become overwhelmed with grief, but these are moments in which you can stop and reflect upon why you have so much love for this man's work and how important he is to you. I've in recent years, largely because of this podcast, largely because of the direction this podcast has gone, and my focus has been on the post Connery Bond films. I've had the opportunity to express my devotion to On Her Majesty's Secret Service. I've had the opportunity to rewire your brain on Moonraker. I've had the opportunity to celebrate Roger Moore and his movies. And in fact, I've probably spent less time reflecting on just how much I love those Connery movies, and I suppose this is an opportunity to do precisely that.
Yeah, and Graham, I mean, when you look at those Connery movies as well, and I know that we'll come to it, you just can't think of James Bond without thinking of Sean Connery, and different actor that landed in that role. If Connery hadn't been cast in there, I think we could have been looking at a different direction, different franchise. But Connery kind of made Bond what it was, even though perhaps it's changed a bit. And you look back on those films and you still go, wow, those some of them really do stand the test of time, and Connery still manages to look effortlessly cool.
When you look back on them, you can barely believe how quickly things move in the 1960s. When you think how many films that he packed into such a short space of time, between Dr. No and Diamonds Are Forever, it's 9 years, and there he makes all these films, and the whole style, the whole outlook of the world changes in that short period of time. And it's not as if Bond changes throughout that. He is a constant. All right, the costumes change around him, the way the films are made changes around him, but he is a constant. And I think that's one of the things that I think he really got right with that role, because essentially James Bond is a man out of time. He was created by Ian Fleming, and Ian Fleming was an old snob, very much of the old school. And yet here comes Sean Connery, a very working class man, comes in and turns it into something else. It's sort of lost in between times. It is and it's only an idea that we've really come back to in the latest incarnation by Daniel Craig, which is this whole sort of person sort of like in the elite, but somehow lost in it. And I think that's what helped him carry it through all that time. And I think he's carried that through into a lot of films he's done. He's never conformed to be anything else. He's never put on a Russian accent to play a Russian submarine commander or a Spanish Egyptian swordsmith or whatever he was playing. So it never really conforming, just turning up and being Sean Connery, and everyone loved it for it because that's all you needed.
When you look at those, so I you start revisiting those films. So I recently watched From Russia with Love again, which is obviously, as long-time listeners of this podcast will know, is probably our choice of the best Bond film, and it's just a fantastic film. And Terry, I was looking at that and went, almost by the time you've got two films in, you feel like Connery is so comfortable and has established the character. Whereas, you can get other franchises as well where you launch characters that it can sometimes, you can still be 3 films in and you still don't feel that the actor's got a grip on it. But by film 2, you knew exactly what Bond was, even if he might not have been exactly who Fleming had in mind for it when he wrote the stories.
Yes, indeed. I mean, he has a tremendous screen presence. There's that anecdote, which may or may not be true, about Spielberg saying that when he was shooting him for last Indiana Jones, The Last Crusade, that he had to adjust the screen, the camera, that he didn't, his screen presence was such that he was overshadowing Harrison Ford, who was the lead in show, every time they were in the same shot together, and he had to just ever so slightly just move it along just to Harrison Ford more screen presence in order to compensate for the physical, almost spiritual presence that Connery has. He's a magnet, and probably maybe not the actor, as Graham I think possibly alludes to, with the greatest range. But when you've got a presence like that on screen, you don't need it that much, really, do you? And to play a character like James Bond, the kind of character that James Bond is, you can understand why they, Saltzman and Broccoli looked at them and thought, my God, this guy, he's huge, he's handsome, hugely charismatic, and exudes that charisma, through celluloid, through a series of chemicals passing through into your brain. It's an extraordinary talent to have. Mercifully, I think he probably didn't think too much about playing the role and just simply did it. It came naturally to him. And it's, in a way, it's a miracle, really, because, I mean, you're right. It could have, there have been other franchises or other series and other action heroes that have come and gone. And the ones that succeed are the ones where the actor gets it bang on straight away. And obviously Sean Connery is one of the definitive examples of that.
Yeah, Graham, I mean, what when we look back on sort of Bond, and, we've talked a lot about the stereotypes and the tropes and the cultural impact of Bond. A lot of that can obviously be traced back to Connery. When we look at Bond today, like, how much can you see that has been informed by what Connery brought in those early days of the Bond franchise?
I think you've got to look at whenever a new actor has come in to play Bond, they've always said, and pretty much every one of them, it's almost like they've been briefed, has said that you can't follow whoever came previously. You've simply got to bring yourself to it. Now, Moore was the one who really took over. I mean, yes, Lazenby, we love On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but Lazenby he's not an actor. He doesn't come in very well, and a lot of the film he doesn't even talk in it. he is carried through by a supporting cast that is amazing. But when Roger Moore comes in, he goes, well, I can't act like that. That's not what I do. So I'll do what I've been doing in The Saint and The Persuaders and even Ivanhoe, and trust me, everyone will love it. And they did. Gary, they did. They did love it. And so I think a lot of, also as well, what you've seen in the post-Moore era is you've seen actors coming in and saying, well, I want to take this back, or I want to dial it back a bit from what it was. Or I will go back to the source, and we'll update it. We'll give you a Bond for the modern age, because I think with every decade you see that Bond is old hat. It doesn't sit comfortably with whatever our sensibilities are, and that has been the same true throughout the whole history of Bond. It's not something new. It's not something that's come around in the woke modern times. Bond has always been Bond, and Bond has always been problematic for one reason or another. And I think that when Dalton took over and he said, I was going to take it back to Fleming, here I'm going to start smoking again, I'm going to show you a rougher edge, that was really just a backlash to Moore, because Moore had been in there for so long. Then you get Brosnan coming in, and he's got to give you a different Bond. Now this is basically post-Cold War Bond. There are no enemies. You've got to make enemies up. And really, you don't have, you need someone who's a bit lighter on his feet. Not to the same sort of extent as Moore, though I would suggest that he is perhaps as camp, if not even more camp in certain respects than Moore was. And then you bring it round as well into a post 9/11 world, and what do you need now? You need Daniel Craig, and you need him being tough, but you don't need him being snob anymore. That's completely out of it. So you've got to try and airbrush that away. But you can see there are bits in there that they harken back to with Connery, especially with Craig, when you've got, he's driving around in the DB5. The DB5 is synonymous. There have been some fantastic cars, but they always go back to the DB5, don't they? Brosnan drove it, and Craig has driven it in pretty much every film, hasn't he? I think it turns up, and as well there are the musical cues as well, like David Arnold pastiching John Barry whenever he can. So that also brings the feeling of Connery, and as well, Craig was actually wearing similar suits as well. So these are things but these are things that I think people go back to because Connery was so defining in the role. And it's always been the fact that, well, Connery was the best, blah 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 blah. That's always been the narrative since he gave up the role, and it's worked in the franchise's favour as much as against it, because I think it's always helped keep that conversation bubbling under. So I think they've been more than happy to keep that bubbling over. Just to say, oh yeah, we'll compare this Bond to Connery, because, and while the actors may say, well, that's not very helpful for the film company as well, I'm sure it's really, really helpful, because it's kept it alive and kept it going for all this time.
Yeah, I mean, when you kind of look at that Connery kind of the look and the feel that was established in Connery is such a huge part of that. I mean, you mentioned the DB5. I think the iconic shot of him from Goldfinger leaning against there in his smart suit in the hills. It's just a shot that you look at that and you know that's Bond, and you know exactly, just from that one shot, you've got all these inferences that come off from it. And I mean, Terry, I've kind of talked about, how good From Russia with Love is, but I would you say that kind of a lot of really where Connery kind of suddenly lands in and establishes, we've obviously got Dr. No, and you've got From Russia with Love, which are great films which set the franchise up and were hugely popular. And then you have Goldfinger, which is a fantastic film, one that is much kind of parried. But when you look at that is almost Connery on his A game, almost to a kind of the same way that that Moore was on his A game with The Spy Who Loved Me. They've fitted in nicely. They've worked out everything in there, and it's almost like that's the peak. You can't really get much better than that point, and that then informs everything else that comes after it.
Yeah, I think we've concluded before that Goldfinger is the sort of like the first James Bond movie in which the mold is set on what a classic James Bond adventure is. And part of that is that, you know, Connery is now 3 movies into the franchise, into his run, and has the role absolutely down pat. But it is, again, worth just restating what we said earlier, and that was that, you know, he got it from the very first scene in which he appears in Dr. No. He exudes James Bond. So it's not a long journey for him to get to Goldfinger, but there is an ease of his performance, a comfortableness in his role that comes through in Goldfinger. And again, a lot of this is quite simply because also by this point, the James Bond machine is now up and running, and we've got this sort of like classic Bond adventure. And he has the benefit also of a massively increased budget. I mean, I've got that picture to which you refer of him in the hacking jacket, leaning up against the Aston Martin in the Alpine Mountains. I've got a massive picture of that up on my wall. You can't see it at the moment because you're listening to a podcast, but it's I assure you it's there. It is an absolutely gorgeous picture, but the manner with which he's leaning up against it, his arms are in his pockets, you know, he's looking at the camera, you know, he looks great, he looks comfortable, he looks confident, but he's also got that kind of cockish sort of like rebellious air of somebody who, you know, is clearly, you know, a character that's, you know, playing part of the establishment, but at the same time, you know, lives by his own rules, to use a cliche, or lives outside the rules. A man who has a license literally to kill people and not go to prison. And Connery, I just think, exudes that at all times. During most of the franchise, I would argue that perhaps it kind of trails off a bit towards in Diamonds Are Forever, which I know we've talked about as not being our favourite movie, but that for me is Pete Connery, and this is the template, you know, that all other Connery actors look at, you know, and say, you know, this is kind of the gold standard, and what we're doing is a variation on that. But really, you know, that is James Bond. I mean, you don't, if you're going to be a Bond actor, you don't go to Fleming straight away and say, I'm going to get my Bond from Fleming. You say, no, I'll go to Connery and get what I need from him. It doesn't have to be the same, but get what you need from him. And the likelihood is that you'll produce a really good Bond. And I think maybe that's where Craig does get it from. You know, there's a lot of Connery in the Craig movies, to my mind.
I find it really interesting as well with, you know, that iconic shot, which is that you've mentioned, which is worth lingering on, because also when we've talked about Bond being a man out of time, I mean, you know, the books themselves, he is a terrible snob. He's a member of the establishment. And by the time you get to the 60s, that's not really what was going on in the 60s. And yet Connery managed to make this character part of popular culture. Bond is very cool in that movie. And Bond is as much of the 60s as everything else. And yet what you look at where the world was at and how you were moving away from that kind of establishment set, a character like James Bond shouldn't really exist in that area. That feels almost like belongs a couple of decades beforehand. And yet here he is, this kind of example of 60s cool, 60s culture summed up in one shot, which is kind of fascinating. And as you kind of move through, like Bond now, I think Craig potentially sort of made Bond a bit cool again, and they do when you have that changeover of Bond. But you wouldn't necessarily say Bond could ever be as cool as he probably was back in the 60s, because that imprint of culture still always has to then pull back to the 60s. And again, that's because, as you say, you've got an actor in there who is establishment but knows he's not establishment as well in every way that he carries himself in that kind of film. One other thing that I wanted to touch on as well, Graham, was that Terry mentioned Diamonds Are Forever, and by that stage, I think it's not uncharitable to say that Connery was phoning it in a little bit throughout that film. And then when you look at kind of Connery post-Bond, and you compare that with Moore post-Bond as well, I always get the sense that Moore had a much more comfortable relationship with the character once he'd hung up his tuxedo than Connery did. There's so many anecdotes about Moore of just, he seemed to still love Bond and knew how much he meant to people, whereas Connery, and this might be because Connery still kind of could see a lot more of his career ahead of him than Moore, I think, was more comfortable where he was. But Connery definitely felt like he had a slightly more ambivalent relationship over the rest of his career with Bond, albeit he would return to it many times.
You can't look inside someone's head, but you do get a feeling that his relationship with Bond, obviously there was a souring between the producers and himself. For the producers, he was obviously a necessary evil. He was obviously someone who made the franchise. He's obviously someone who was worth the money that he was due. But they didn't want to pay him. I think quite famously, he sued every film company he ever worked for, apart from Paramount. I think they were the only film company he didn't sue. So he was someone who wouldn't put up with the sort of nonsense that film companies are apt to pull on actors. He perhaps felt like that the industry was something to mistrust, whereas Moore saw the industry as something to use, and he had done all the way through. I mean, he was going back to his Saint days when he actually tried to buy the rights to it. So he was savvy to what was going on, and I think he knew that Bond was just a meal ticket for him, and that he was set for life. Really, I mean, he was always he was popular before he got it. So to actually go through it to get the role himself and to hold on to it for so long was great for him. And yeah, I think he really loved that. I mean, he made that role when Moore did it his way, and people hired him because they wanted more Bond. They didn't hire him and say, "Can you play this like Bond but a bit Sean Connery like?" Because he was never going to do that, and they wouldn't have bothered. They could have got Connery in to do that cheaper. As it was in the 70s and 80s, you could get him for next to nothing. So, yeah, it is weird about what their relationship with it. And I think as well, the relationship changed because I think the producers recognised that actors were utilising Bond in their other roles. So they did start putting in things in the contract, like you can't take any other roles where you wear a tuxedo. You cannot do that. So there was they were controlling in some ways, and very very much like the old sort of like the system of Hollywood. But yeah, I think it was more down to his relationship with filmmakers rather than anything about the change of times. And I think that followed it throughout his whole career.
Yeah, Terry. I mean, when you look at Connery post-Bond as well, I think you could probably say he had a slightly tricky 70s.
Definitely. I think, which is unfortunate because, it's worth just bearing in mind that while he was playing James Bond, he also did a movie with Alfred Hitchcock, a film called Marnie, which I don't know if you guys have seen, but it did look as though, for a while he must have perhaps thought or had ambitions of becoming a proper A-lister and a Hollywood royalty. But I would imagine that probably, this happens, I think, less now, but, typecasting was definitely a problem for actors who were played and become synonymous with a specific role for so many years, that they didn't always necessarily find it easy to then move up according to, their own ambitions and expectations.
No, I think that's an interesting point, but I think personally that he was out of time then, because I think Sean Connery as an actor in the 60s was a throwback. I think he's more in the sort of Cary Grant mold than, say, the Paul Newman role, which is what A-listers were becoming as the 60s rolled on. They were looking more at people like Robert Redford and their acting style rather than someone like Sean Connery. And I think this is what Bond was almost an island for him. He was someone that they wanted, a David Niven type, or a Cary Grant or a James Mason role. But these, by the time this comes around, these guys are not getting leading roles anymore. These are being sidelined. These are playing old men now, not old men being sleazy with Audrey Hepburn. These are being old men with old wives. So I think this is what held back Sean Connery's career in certain respects, but then it also gave it a bit of gravitas when he came around back in the 80s. I think it was that gravitas that really gave him his second lease of life in the 80s. And yeah, of course, he does a pile of garbage in the 70s. He also does a load of really good films as well.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, I agree. I mean, he was going to. I think he probably had ambitions of being of joining the royalty set, and things had moved on, and I think he'd been typecast. And there were other issues as well, maybe surrounding his appearance. It was well known that he wore a wig, during the movies, and that might have had a problem. And also, as I said, he had tremendous range as well. So maybe he wasn't, wasn't the actor that would get that very, very best roles. But as I was about to say, he would have been used to being king of the hill of the Bond franchise. The star of the movies. An iconic character, world famous actor. And then to go from that, and then to go perhaps to find yourself being cast in roles in which, you're not in movies that aren't like that anymore, which you don't get to go down, you don't get to meet, heads of state. You don't get to shake hands or bow to the Queen, at movie premieres with that. And that might have sort of added to the general malaise. That and the fact that 70s movies in character altered. They became a lot browner, didn't they? And as Graham points out, that's, Connery looks beautiful in Technicolor, and the 70s sort of started moving away from that, really. And I don't think he kind of really got that. He wasn't a Pacino, was he, or anything like that.
Well, I mean, you've got, I think one of the most interesting films that you've got in probably the latter Connery, when I think that there are a few films where he started sort of coming back in, and it probably came back into fashion to a certain extent, but again, touched on where he could put his range and almost playing to his strengths. And Graham, probably one of those was The Name of the Rose, the Umberto Eco adaptation. And that, to me, felt like you have a few films, and that was one of them, where I think people looked at Connery and went, well, hang on, you've got an adaptation here from a very different type of literary genius than Fleming. And actually you've got Connery can do, he's still going to be Sean Connery, but he's bringing something else to the role. And again, you kind of see that through some of his other ones as well. Red October, which we've mentioned, which is very much still Connery being Connery, but he's expanding out a little bit and able to still bring that kind of difference and gravitas and magnetism that potentially people had forgotten about by that stage, and obviously culminates in The Untouchables, for which he gets an Oscar.
Yeah, there is a point, isn't there, in the 80s where he goes from being leading man to becoming the mentor, the guy that the leading man leans on to carry him through, to show him how to be the hero he needs to be. In The Name of the Rose, of course, he's the detective, but he's also mentoring the younger monk there as well, isn't he? Into solving the mystery, and of course in the Untouchables, he's the hard-nosed, in inverted commas, Irish cop, bejesus, who is teaching a very fresh-faced Kevin Costner the Chicago way. Yes, but that's how it goes on from there, isn't it? I mean, I think Highlander comes before Name of the Rose, and then you've got the Untouchables. Three great films in a row. If something's going to reignite your film career, I think those three were the way to do it. And yeah, for the next 5 or 6 years, he's gold, isn't he? And he just comes out in loads of films, and that they know that he is either he is starring in them himself, and it's usually when he's actually starring opposite someone else that he gets the bigger draw. So Hunt for October, the Untouchables, those are the ones where he gets, and Highlander even. These are the ones where he's so much more comfortable and has such an impact, and it has such an impact in this sort of like this almost cameo type role. I think Time Bandits was the one that really entered that. But I think Time Bandits just comes a couple of years before Name of the Rose. And yet he's two entirely different characters there. He's in King Agamemnon there, and he's like he's like strong, he's powerful. And then you come back a couple of years later, and he's like an old monk.
It's 5 years, in fairness, and he does never say never again in between those.
Yeah.
Where he Highlander and Name of the Rose are out of the same year, so he's incredibly. In fairness. What you can say about him is that he works. I mean, he's pushing out movies, almost every year since he's quit. I mean, since he leaves Bond, and yeah. I mean, look, we tend we kind of be a bit unkind and think of Zardoz, and maybe to an extent maybe the Anderson tapes, which is not a very strong movie, But there's films like Robin and Marion in the 1970s as well. That's a different kind of Robin Hood movie, and still pretty decent. And if you like, and I think we mentioned beforehand, Meteor. These are enjoyable films, first great train robbery, if not necessarily classics. But I mean, I think it's also worth mentioning that by this point Spielberg has seen him and says, I want him in one of my movies, and he goes into Last Crusade. And yeah, again, as Graham points out, in this sort of, is it a mentoring role? I don't know. He plays an antagonist towards his son, doesn't he? And they have that wonderful relationship that's clearly very loving, while at the same time they just cannot, his son resents the father because he neglected him, and then the father neglects the son because he's frankly better. He's become better at it, and at the job. And it's a glorious chemistry, and they work really, really well. And while I have reservations about the conclusion of that movie, I personally think that in terms of the conclusion of that film, they chose poorly. But I mean, in terms of of Connery's performance, it is genuinely outstanding. And yeah, I mean, he just goes on and becomes. I mean, for me, Red October is just Graham and I have a mutual friend for whom Red October is his very favourite movie, and you can see why. But just a few words, if I may, on Graham's remarks about how he doesn't play when he plays foreigners. He plays like non-Scottish people, and he plays them unashamedly. So I think that's perfectly legitimate way to portray people, because what you're doing is you're portraying the person. You're not portraying their nationality.
Yeah.
And the characters that he plays are defined by the kind of human beings there. Marco Ramius is a specific type of human being, and that's the kind of human being that Connery plays him, and he plays him expertly. I mean, his nationality is important in terms of the plot of the film, but it's not important in terms of the kind of human being that he is. And so it's perfectly legitimate to not affect an accent. I think it's weird when people say, that person's, doesn't affect this accent. I mean, like, if you really badly want someone to play a Russian character, then cast a Russian, But if you don't, if you want them to be played by a Western actor, then just say, look, have at it, mate, and just do what you have to do. I mean, I think it's perfectly legitimate, and doubly so with Highlander. I love the fact that he's half Spanish and half Egyptian.
I think one of the things for me as well, when you look at Connery as a whole, and we mentioned a lot of those films, and then you look who he's also on screen with, and I think this picks up on your point as well, Graham. Like, he's on screen with Harrison Ford, Kevin Costner. Obviously, in Name of the Rose, you've got a very young Christian Slater in there as well. You've got you've got actors who, like, if you looked and you went, yeah, these are Hollywood heavyweights. These are people who are not bad actors, and yet Connery is the one who you're drawn to in these films. Even if he's not in a good film, and I'm thinking of, say, you go on a little bit later and you've got a film like Entrapment, for example, which is not one of his finest hours, but again, just the camera is completely drawn to him, and you've got these kind of modern Hollywood royalty or modern kind of Hollywood A-listers who can carry a movie by themselves, who are guaranteed at this point in time, certainly with the likes of kind of Costner and Ford and Nicolas Cage as well. These are people who you can put top billing, and you relatively guaranteed of returns. So they're all good actors, and yet Connery will just outshine them all on screen because he has just that kind of old school magnetism. And again, I think this goes back to your point as well, Terry, that he is, and Graham, that we talked about earlier, about that kind of, he's got that element of very old school Hollywood, those really magnetic characters on screen. Like, you think of Connery, and then you potentially also think in Bond, you also go back a little bit to, say, somebody like Bogart in Casablanca, who has that same kind of louche coolness about him. It's very kind of old school Hollywood. And you see that when you get these older actors who start, taking these mentor roles or sort of appear against that younger generation of A-listers. There's just something that the camera absolutely loves them and cannot get away from them. And they enhance the movie. You can have a bad movie with them in, and there's still bits to enjoy. And I find it, I think that to me is probably one of the great compliments that you can give Connery as an actor. That, yeah, sure, like Moore, he potentially didn't have the greatest range. You could look at somebody like Dalton or Craig and say that they have a much greater range. You could cast them in lots of other things, which they have been, and you'll get a good response, and they can adapt. But there's that magnetism that you've got with somebody like Connery that is just really hard, even for some other A-listers to compete with.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point. I did while you were talking, I was thinking about American equivalents to him, and the closest I can think of would be someone like Clint Eastwood. And again, like Connery, around very, very much at the same time, but were sort of lost in that sort of post sort of golden age Hollywood, and before that sort of late 60s, 70s new wave of leading men. But again, someone who had a resurgence in his career when he became older and became this more sort of like the old hand mentoring or just grey-haired old crazy man in the corner. But very much that sort of same amount of screen presence. Just some people who, and like Moore, he didn't put on a different voice. I mean, he turned up and was Clint Eastwood, wasn't he? And that's the sort of. But that harkens back to that golden age. You never see James Mason turn up in the film and as anyone else but him. But that amount of presence is key. I mean, Henry Fonda was making films into the 80s, but he was an old man by then, but still had that presence when he comes in there, and when you take an actor like that, Once Upon a Time in America is a very very Once Upon a Time in the West is a very a good example of that, where he's got so much presence there, and you get the feeling that you'll never see actors like that again, because that's not the sort of development path they come through on. It's always great when you see those actors go up against modern actors, where you see two different types of actors in the same film, and it works well. We see it in the James Bond franchise. We talked about it a few weeks ago, didn't we? When we talked about how Christopher Walken and Roger Moore work so well together on the screen. Shouldn't work, but it does. It works brilliantly. And you think of other examples. I think a great example, a very, very famous example, is Dustin Hoffman and Laurence Olivier in Marathon Man, when they're on the screen. Two entirely different actors, two amazingly good actors. And these are brilliant actors, but they come together on the screen from an entirely different point of view, and it still works.
Yeah, there was nothing method about Olivier, was there?
No.
And there was nothing method about Connery, I suspect. He was just very much, these were his lines, and just act, dear boy, act.
Yeah.
I think as well, given that we've kind of wandered into this area, should we touch on a film that we all have a lot of time and love for? Because it feels like it's a really relevant film to almost kind of bookend Connery's career. Admittedly, he made plenty of other films afterwards. But Terry, that is The Rock, the probably the unofficial James Bond outing, where you obviously have Nicolas Cage in there as well, but there's no doubt that is Connery's film all the way through into there. And I'm just going to hand over to you to let you talk about The Rock, because I suspect you are probably going to have thoughts, feelings, opinions, and a lot of love.
I've said it, must have said it before on numerous occasions. We definitely have. I mean, The Rock should be regarded as an unofficial James Bond film. And not an unofficial James Bond film in the way that Never Say Never Again is, in that it's got an original script as opposed to a rehashed version of Thunderball. Obviously it is Cage's vehicle, and technically Connery is playing a supporting actor. And so I suppose you can say, oh no, it's not actually a James Bond film because John Mason isn't the lead character. But I mean, he does steal this film. He makes the film what it is. Just for people who haven't seen it, they must have done. Obviously, he's playing an old British Secret Service agent who's been captured, presumably by the American Secret Service at some point, and has been squirreled away and has been disavowed by by Her Majesty's government, and has met a fate that is consistent with the potential fate of James Bond, the character. That is not something that's outlandish in a James Bond story. That could. And an old James Bond, effectively washed up, makes one too many mistakes, doesn't quit probably when he should do, doesn't take the desk job, ends up out in the cold, and then it finds himself basically in a maximum security prison, in the United States. And I always like to think, I can't remember the name of the character, the guy who has the massive beef with, I'm afraid. But it's played by the guy from The West Wing, and there's real beef between those two, and I would like to think that guy is also effectively Felix Leiter in that role, and that it's just a friendship that's gone massively sour, and it's a counterfactual of a fictional construct, so it makes complete sense. Or if you want to borrow a Star Trek expression, it's a mirror universe, maybe. But I think it's a great example of where James Bond could have gone.
I think it's the final reel that Diamonds Are Forever needed. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, totally, absolutely. That would have been great. I mean, I think that we should, petition whoever it is who makes these decisions, and I don't think it's anybody, that it actually be adopted. as a James Bond film. I mean, there are Star Trek fans who put on their DVD shelves next to all their Star Trek movies, they put Galaxy Quest in. And I think that The Rock should have similar status with James Bond fans.
That's just because you're a massive Michael Bay fan, though, isn't it? Though. Sorry.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. This is the amazing thing, is that I loathe Michael Bay's movies in general. But I mean, I do adore this movie. I mean, one of my favourite scenes that Sean Connery's ever been in is the sequence when he's confronted with Ed Harris's character in The General in and he says, "If you ask me, you're a fucking lunatic." I think that's just a brilliant scene, and it also, it is actually beautifully observed, well written, because it's that stereotypical sort of like British snarkiness at the Americans, and that kind of like stereotypical American uptightness and sense of duty, and it plays it really, really well. And it's just beautifully shot. I mean, it's a beautifully made film. I mean, it's very, very exciting, fantastic. Basically, it's set in San Francisco. I mean, what more could you want out of an action film? And what more could you want out of a James Bond film?
I think it's actually. I know we're on Connery, but it struck me as a slight side tangent. That I am with you. I am not the greatest Michael Bay fan in the world, but The Rock is a cracking film, and there's no doubt that Bay could do action sequences. Can you imagine if, like, Michael Bay had taken one of the lesser Brosnans, shall we say, and went into there? Or even if Michael Bay was working like 20 years earlier and had Ken Adam next to him as well on the production design, I reckon you could have got a cracking film out of that.
Yeah, maybe. Sorry, Graham, go on.
No, go ahead.
No, I wasn't saying anything. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. No, I'm just trying to process that in my head now, Gary. I'm trying to think of where he would have gone if he'd been given given the keys to Bond. I think you would have loved it. I mean, because I think another thing about the Rock that Terry also loves is the fact it's a Hans Zimmer soundtrack as well, isn't it?
It is, which I know. Can I say I can't wait to hear the soundtrack to No Time to Die. I was very excited about that. May I perhaps make an observation that instead of looking at Michael Bay, we should be looking at Jerry Bruckheimer, the producer.
Yes.
I mean, this is very much peak Bruckheimer. We're talking Bad Boys, Crimson Tide, Con Air, Armageddon. These are the kind of movies they are. I mean, it would have been very interesting if maybe they'd given Jerry Bruckheimer the keys to a Bond movie to see what would have happened there. But again, I mean, we're moving into fan fiction here, guys.
It would have been all the explosions.
Absolutely all the explosions, and lots of like extremely, and lots of terrible villains, ghastly villains, really awful people. Man, that would have been quite cool, actually.
We'll bring it back to Connery, and we've talked obviously a fair bit on there. Connery's legacy overall, and we've kind of gone through his career from coming in, and obviously his great screen presence. Graham, what kind of legacy would you say that Connery has kind of left onto the Bond franchise?
Not a very comfortable one, I don't think. I think he's left something that every actor that's followed him has had to live up to, but that's kept them on their toes. That's actually made them work for it. And I think when you look at each one who's come afterwards, they've had to try and imprint their own personality on there, if they've got a personality, to try and get something out of the role, and with varying degrees of success. Of course, I think that the whole of the Eon production line has been based on Connery's interpretation of Bond. And in fact, the later books were tailored because of Connery's portrayal of Bond. Famously, Fleming resisted Connery's casting in the role, but was completely blown away by Dr. No, and obviously with good reason, because he played him perfectly. May not have been Fleming's snobbish ideal of the person who he wanted to be, because that's who Bond was, but yeah, he defined the role and he defined Bond. So I think that obviously anyone who takes the role now has to tip a hat to him. You can ignore everyone else in between, really. But you've got to go back to first principles, and Connery is first principles as far as Bond is concerned. Not Fleming. People can say, "Oh, you've got to go back to Fleming," but what they really mean is you've got to go back to Connery.
Yeah, Terry, what's your take on Connery's legacy for the franchise?
Yeah, I mean, he is the gold standard of James Bond. I mean, he is the original and the definitive James Bond, and I mean, you can love and enjoy and prefer his successors if you wish. You can absolutely do that. But what I don't think you can deny is that this franchise would not be anything that it is now. And it probably wouldn't even be around now were it not for those early movies, were it not for Connery. And it's not, of course, it's not just down to him. Of course it isn't. It's down to Broccoli and Saltzman. It's down to Peter Hunt. It's down to Ken Adam. It's down to a whole host of people who breathed life and gave life to this franchise. But at the centre of it is the actor that plays James Bond. And if it hadn't have been for him, it just simply wouldn't have been as successful as it was. And he defined the role of James Bond and then set that marker. And everybody then, any actor who looks at James Bond, as Graham says, they go to Connery first. By all means, go to Fleming, go to Roger Moore, go to Pierce, definitely go to Tim, and definitely go to Daniel. But because, I mean, for me, I think Daniel is probably the second best James Bond. It's a massively subjective thing. But you must start at Connery before anything else. He's the original.
Well, I mean, I was going to wrap up, but also I think one thing that's fair to mention, and just given that we are doing tributes as well, I don't think we can pass this podcast, Terry, without talking about Diana Rigg as well, who passed between us doing our previous podcast and this one. And when we've talked about screen presence as well, I think you can fair to say that if you've got a definitive Bond in Connery, you've also got almost somebody who, along with Telly Savalas, carries a Bond movie almost by herself as well.
Yeah. I completely agree. I mean, obviously, a wonderful actress who played a variety of different roles, all the way up to very, very recently. Whole generation of Game of Thrones fans who know and love Diana Rigg for the character that she played in that. But obviously, for those of us of a certain vintage who, remember the Avengers, and obviously for those of us who adore On Her Majesty's Secret Service and, then adore Diana Rigg. And yeah, I mean, I have defended George Lazenby's honour despite some of the frankly scurrilous criticisms, unwarranted, scurrilous, unworthy, and, frankly, just downright mean criticisms by some people on this podcast, specifically Graham, about George Lazenby's performances. But he is fundamentally correct in his analysis. And this movie is carried by, Telly Savalas and Diana Rigg. And she makes him look great and makes it work, and works extremely hard and probably has to be extremely patient with this guy who's just a model. He doesn't really know how to act. Hasn't had any training. doesn't have any of the acting disciplines. But more, she just lends herself to it. She's an authentic and believable, character who can win the heart of James Bond, and that's the toughest thing that she does, is that she wins the heart of a character whose heart is up until that point totally impregnable, and she does it and convincingly. We believe it. When George Lazenby rather woodenly declares his love for for Tracy in that wooden barn. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's made of wood, that barn. We may as well get as much wood out there as possible. There's plenty of wood going on in that scene.
Later Wood with Chris Wood as well. The franchise.
We believe it. The audience believes that James Bond, a man as cold-hearted and cold-blooded as James Bond, could give it all up for Tracy, and it's fantastic, and it's a crowning achievement on a whole list of wonderful performances that she's put in throughout her career. And I don't think I can say anything kinder about her.
Yeah, and Graham as well. Like, Terry sort of talked about just how fine an actress she was, and also when we touch on that kind of almost old school charm and coolness. If Connery was cool, Diana Rigg wasn't just cool. She was firmly imprinted, I probably imagine, onto the brain of every teenage boy in that era as well. And just a fantastic icon of screen and cinema as well. And, the fact that she's appeared in one movie, but yet if you were going to kind of hone down on one brilliant Bond girl, you've got to fancy that Diana Rigg would be right up the top there as well.
Well, certainly. She makes it look effortless, and of course it's not. It requires a hell of a lot of work for something like that. But the fact that she does carry him through this, she does all the heavy lifting, and it doesn't look like she's doing that at all, and makes it believable, makes it credible, makes you. Well, you fall in love with her as well, because that's what she's there to do, and she does it perfectly. She is here as this damaged individual, and yet you're so vulnerable, but also strong, powerful. People say about Bond has finally met his match, and this is when he actually did, and yeah, she was brilliant, and she's been brilliant, as Terry said, all the way through to still working to within a few years ago. So it's fine. That for me is sums Diana Rigg up, because she wasn't just a pretty face. She wasn't just someone who was just gonna.
Sorry, we have an intruder in at this point. Somebody who's also very upset about Diana Rigg's passing.
I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised. I'm there too. I was like that. I've had a while now to sort of to restore myself, but yeah, I was like that for days, basically.
I think it's fair to say, and we have 2020's been a rubbish year in many respects, but it's sad to have lost two real icons of the screen, and two icons who I think made Bond what it is. And I think for me, I really kind of got to say, I posted this on Twitter, but I think the fitting quote is the final lines from On Her Majesty's Secret Service, especially for Diana Rigg, which is, she's only resting, she's only sleeping. We've got all the time in the world. And that is probably, I know that we've talked a lot about Connery, but that to me is probably one of the best moments of the Bond franchise completely. And as Terry said, there is no way you could have got to that bit, even with an actor who is potentially not as versatile or emotionally good at conveying emotion as Lazenby. But that last scene in there, and I think that to me is one of her biggest legacies. It's a real punch, and it's just one of the most beautifully vulnerable moments of the whole franchise in there. Probably one of the best scenes I think, in Bond history, which doesn't involve Connery.
Yeah, she turns James Bond into a human being for a few minutes, rather than a cartoon character. And I mean, that's a wonderful gift to give to James Bond fans.
Yeah, totally. So I guess it remains for me to say thank you to both of you. And, 2021, there'll be a new Bond film eventually, whenever it hits the cinemas or streaming service or however else we'll be getting it in 2021. And then potentially a new Bond to look forward to. And of course, there will be more podcasts this year as well with us. So you've got more to look forward to as well. But any final thoughts from either of you two on what is really, I guess, a passing of an era for James Bond?
Yeah, I think it's weird. I actually went through the release dates of old Bond films. And I worked out that there's been more of a gap between the scheduled release of No Time to Die and the supposedly actual release date of No Time to Die than there was between From Russia with Love and Goldfinger.
Wow.
Yeah, wow. So this film has got to come out sooner or later, isn't it? It's just got to come out. Otherwise, people will forget Bond, won't they? No, they won't. Because we've got Connery, and how can you forget that? So
he's on every bloody day on ITV4. How can you possibly forget him?
Well, if you're constantly watching ITV4, Terry, then yes, obviously.
What are you trying to say? What's being inferred here? We knew this day would come because obviously people move on, people pass on, and he was an old man, and this is what happens, and it's the circle of life, and it's a glorious and beautiful thing. But I mean, Sean Connery's immortal.
In celluloid, he lives forever.
Indeed.
And so, that reminds me to say thank you to Terry and Graham as ever. Thank you to you, dear listener, for indulging us in an hour and a bit of Sean Connery chat. And obviously, you can leave your own thoughts and from everything, whether you view The Rock as an official James Bond film, and if you don't, then more fool you. But also your other thoughts as to where Connery took the role. And you can get us on Twitter and on Facebook. And do remember as well that if you haven't yet subscribed to us on your podcast subscription platform of choice, then please do, because you'll get more lukewarm, dubious hot takes throughout the franchise of James Bond. And also you can dig back into our back catalogue of Roger Moore bit by bit, and also look through other bits and pieces like our wonderful directors or our wonderful fan commentaries of a few of the Bond films as well, of which there will be, I'm sure, more coming soon. Until then, just wish to say goodbye and get your vodka martinis up and raise a toast to Sir Sean Connery, or as I was nearly going there, Sir Sean Connery. Goodbye.
Sir Sean Connery. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks very much for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, then consider subscribing if you don't already. If you don't use a podcatcher, then perhaps you could tell your friends about us. So thanks very much again, and we'll see you next time, where we'll be discussing the first James Bond movie, Dr. No.